Hey everyone, we are at the AMD event for RX Vega and Threadripper, along with some WX stuff as well. I'm joined by Mike Mantor, who is a corporate fellow at AMD. Mike works a lot on the architecture side of things, so very knowledgeable on actual GPU, low-level architecture. We're going to be focusing on one topic today, which is primitive discard and culling. Before getting to that, this content is brought to you by the Thermaltake Flow RGB closed-loop liquid cooler, which is a 360mm radiator plus 3120 fans that are RGB illuminated. The Thermaltake Rain fans at that. This uses a 4.5 Gen Asetek pump, which is one of the faster pumps. You can learn more at the link in the description below. So the first question, I guess, is what is the small primitives discarder, or what do we need to know about the basics before diving into it?
Yeah, let's just talk about the basics at the high level, right? When an application sends or renders objects, every object has characteristics. A model is built for an object that's then rendered into a 3D scene. And an object is usually modeled as a complete object. So no matter how you're viewing it, where it is in your field of view, the representation's there, and these models move around in view space. And the graphics processor processes the triangles of the process or of the objects that are in the field of view and decides whether or not they're visible. And so one of the first things that happen when we run or we draw an object is we do run a shader sooner or later that processes the vertices and creates vertex positions in a common view space. And part of the state data that defines the common view space is a view frustum. That's to decide whether or not the triangles or the triangles of an object or the primitives of an object are actually within the view or outside of the view. So you can think if objects are completely outside the view, there's no reason to send them down the graphics pipeline. And many times applications do the first level process of culling before the object is ever even sent to the GPU. Or they may send a coarse representation of the geometry, which is just a few triangles, to query the GPU whether or not the object's even in the view. If it's not in the view, there's no reason to send it to the rasterizer if you can predetermine that. And if it's a very complex object, instead of taking the time to render it, you can send down a bunch of bounding volumes, find out whether or not each object is visible or might be visible in some way, right? So when the object comes to the graphics pipe and we do the position processing, you can think that there's different kind of culling. So part of the object might be outside of my field of view and part of the triangles are gone. The backside of the object is made up of triangles too that are not visible or viewable. And then obviously you can have an object that's in space such that part of the triangle is far away, and when it projects in the screen space, they become very small triangles, the front facing ones. So I really described three different scenarios there where I may be outside of the view frustum, the triangle might be back faced, or the triangle somehow in screen space can become very small. And so for most content that comes to the GPU, we see on average more than 50% of the triangles that come down the pipeline are still in a place where they don't need to be rendered, meaning we don't need to scan, convert them, and process them. And the earlier that we can determine that the triangle's out of the view frustum, the triangle's back face cold, or the triangle is too small to hit any samples when you go to render it, the quicker we can remove any effect of that triangle from the rendering process.
So your immediate goal is reducing the load on, I guess, overall pipeline, just to get stuff out of the way that doesn't need to be there so you can free up resources for other tasks.
Yeah, and just unnecessary work. So in the chips that we've been building for a while now, we have a vertex process that runs, and it could either be a domain shader or it could actually be a vertex shader. It could be a vertex process on the output of a geometry shader that's doing amplification or decimation. And at that point, when you finally have the final position of the vertices of the triangle, is one point where we can always find out whether or not the triangle is inside of the frustum, back-faced, or too small to hit. And from a frustum testing, you know, there's a mathematical way to figure out whether or not a vertex is inside of a view frustum. And if any one of the vertices are inside the view frustum, then we'll know that that triangle could potentially create pixels. To do a back-face culling perspective, you can find two edges. So with the three vertices, you can find one edge and a second edge, and then you can take a cross product of that and determine the facedness of the triangle. And you can then dot product that with the eye ray, and if it's a positive result, then it's facing in the direction of the view, and if it's negative, it's a back face triangle and you don't need to do it. Now, geometry can be defined with two-sided geometry or one-sided geometry, so state data goes into whether or not you can opportunistically throw a triangle away. So you can be rendering something where you can actually fly inside of an object and see the interior of it, and then when you come outside, you can see it from the outside in. In those cases, you can't do back face culling. And then the last one is really a zero area triangle. And depending on how fine grained your sampling is, it can become less and less.
Is that zero area as in effectively zero visibility because it's just that small? It's
just that small in screen space, and you can determine that it's not going to invoke any sample in the sampling process.
So is this you're looking at something between samples that you're taking and getting rid of that because it's not touching any samples?
Because it doesn't touch any samples, not inclusive of any samples. And again, it's a test. And then as we've talked today a bit about our prim shader, which I think is what's kind of invoked some of this discussion, correct, is that when we traditionally have done a vertex shader, we do position and then we do attribute calculation, which is per vertex data. And after we've produced a per vertex data to be used in an interpolation process for attribute data to go into a pixel shader, we have to store that attribute data in a place that can be accessed when we're launching pixel shaders. And so in the Vega architecture, one of the challenges that we set out to take care of is that when we want to increase our efficiency at which we operate and work. So we looked at one of the places that we could make an improvement in the latest architectures is to be able to discard primitives before we store the attribute data, so that our storage in between the vertex processing and the pixel processing can be more effective at storing data that's really going to be needed for pixel shaders that are going to be launched.
So I guess if you're looking at this in terms of a canonical view of the render pipeline, this type of culling happens essentially in one of the first stages, it sounds like.
The culling without a prim shader happens after all vertex shading, which means we've already created that attribute data. When we go in the prim shader, we can do it before we can do the position process. And then if we can create a prim shader, we can have access to the three vertices of a prim or two or one, depending on what kind of primitive you are, and do the culling process, and then conditionally do the attribute processing and the writing of the attribute data. So one of the advantages of this new primitive processing is that you can remove the geometry before any attribute data is stored and before any primitive data gets into the pipeline. And once you put a primitive into the pipeline, somewhere later it potentially takes a clock cycle to take it out and discard it. So if we can discard it before you send it down the river, the river doesn't have it in there. Yeah.
Right. And what about for differences with Vega specifically versus previous architectures you've worked on? Are there any major milestones and changes? I guess the prim shader's the big one we've been talking about. But if we look back at Fiji, for example, are there any major differences there that are of note for Vega?
Oh, yes. As we talked in the release, there's quite a few, right? So as we talked about, the optimizations that we did to increase the frequency are a big challenge. So in the same process as the Polaris class of GPUs, we've uplifted the frequency, on a kind of a minimum of 400 megahertz.
Yeah, approaching 1700.
Yes. Oh, actually exceeding 1700. So we're saying we can run at least 1700, and depending on the product defined, the device is capable and will burst up above 1700.
So when you're pulling the primitives out of the pipeline earlier, it sounds like, if I understand, just to recap, it sounds like you're saving potentially on a lost cycle because you're removing it before it's ever consumes the cycle. And then is there an effect to memory bandwidth as well, or anything else outside of cycles?
Yes, there can be. So a lot of times, I use the example of the cup, and you got a bunch of back face triangles on the back side. So usually when we call a primitive, we can call a group of primitives that are interconnected in a way, which means then there's certain vertices that will not need attribute processing at all. And attribute processing involves fetching per vertex attribute data from memory into the shader and then doing some kind of calculations in it to prepare it for use in shading, or at least position it in the on-chip storage for use for that. So if I were doing my cup, for instance, and if I send this down the pipeline and I don't do any backface calling for the triangles on the back side, all of these vertices making up the primitives back there will have to fetch their attribute data, when really all we need is what's visible on the front side of things.
What sort of resource gets used on the GPU when you're fetching asset data? What's being engaged?
The whole cache hierarchy and the memory pins, right? So we already do vertex reuse in most cases, so each vertex is only fetching data once, and then we reference it from that one fetch. Or in other words, a vertex can bring in cache lines, neighboring vertices. If they happen to be co-located in memory, can find their data in cache lines. But so the whole cache hierarchy into the shader array, the shader's doing the per vertex, any kind of calculations you have to do, and then storing the data off into internal storage in the chip. It's an interesting amount of circuitry that's engaged, yeah.
Is there an average percentage of objects that you're able to call?
Yeah, I think when we first started talking here, that roughly in most scenes that we look at, greater than 50% of the triangles are called, which kind of makes sense just when we look at the object perspective, right? Half of an object is usually visible in the other half, but it can vary quite greatly, right? Just depending on the scene and the geometry. Sometimes it can be as high as 80 to 90%.
And I guess the process, sounds like you're stepping through the process of figuring out which items to call in a way that theoretically there should be no visible impact to what the user's seeing. In other words, you're not like reducing the geometric complexity or the visible geometric complexity by doing this.
No, it's not changing the complexity of anything that you're doing. In every sample or pixel, so anything that the rasterizer is going to sample is not discarded. So it's all very conservative discard, and actually that's very important, that you can only discard the things that have no impact to the scene.
Right. Yeah. For folks who saw our Vega FE coverage, energy was one of the applications that really saw a massive uplift in performance versus previous architectures too. So it just depends on what you're doing, as always.
Yes.
Any other major items of note here you want to go over before we close out?
No, I think that does it. Hopefully this helps you and your readers understand.
Well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you all for watching. As always, you can subscribe for more. Links in the description below for more information, or if you want transcriptions of some of this to make it a bit easier to consume. And we'll see you all next time. We had Sam Nafziger on previously, and there's someone in the comments making fun of the corporate fellow title. Like, they just thought they thought it meant some kind of like marketing executive. They're like, oh no, like much different. Yeah.